February 16, 1945. Dawn breaks cold and metallic over Iwo Jima. The volcanic ash still smolders beneath the boots of American Marines, clawing their way up Mount Suribachi. 700 miles to the north, across a gray expanse of Pacific waters that have swallowed thousands, Japanese radar operators sit in darkened rooms on the home islands, headphones pressed against their ears, listening for the rhythmic pulse that means death is coming. They hear it now, the deep, synchronized thunder of engines that can only mean one thing. B-29, Superfortresses, again. But today, there is something different in the sound, something higher-pitched, angrier, weaving between the bomber formations like needles through fabric. The operators lean forward, adjusting frequencies, trying to understand. Then the reports start flooding in from forward observation posts along the coast. Fighter aircraft, American fighter aircraft. Not the stubby Grumman Hellcats they know from carrier battles. Not the twin-boomed Lightnings that sometimes venture from captured Pacific islands. These are sleek, silver machines with bubble canopies and distinctive wing shapes, flying alongside the B-29s at altitudes that should be impossible, at distances that defy everything the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force has calculated, planned for, and believed. The P-51 Mustang has arrived over Tokyo. In the ready rooms of Japanese fighter bases surrounding the capital, veteran pilots receive the scramble order with expressions that blend duty and disbelief. Some of these men have been flying since the China campaigns of 1937. They have fought over Nanking and Singapore, dueled American pilots over Guadalcanal and Rabaul. They know the mathematics of aerial warfare with the certainty of men who have staked their lives on fuel calculations and engine performance charts. And those calculations have told them for years that Japan's geographic fortress is impregnable to escort fighters. The home islands lie too far from any American base. No single-engine fighter in the world can carry enough fuel to escort bombers here and return. It is a law of physics as immutable as gravity. Or so they believed. The story of that belief and its shattering begins not in the skies over Japan, but in the careful assumptions of military planners on both sides of the Pacific. Since the earliest days of strategic bombing theory, developed by men like Italian General Giulio Douhet and American Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, the equation has been brutally simple. Bombers must travel vast distances to reach enemy industrial centers, but fighters cannot carry enough fuel to accompany them. The bomber, therefore, must be a self-defending fortress, bristling with machine guns, relying on formation discipline and armored plating to survive fighter attacks. This theory had shaped aircraft design throughout the 1930s, culminating in machines like the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a name chosen deliberately to express this philosophy. For the Japanese defenders watching American bombers approach their islands in 1944 and early 1945, this theory became an article of faith. The B-29, largest and most sophisticated bomber of the war, operated from captured islands in the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. These bases lay approximately 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. A round trip, accounting for combat maneuvering and reserves, meant bomber crews faced a 3,200-mile mission. The B-29 could manage this distance, barely, thanks to its massive fuel capacity and efficient high-altitude engines. But fighters? Impossible. The range was too great. The fuel requirements too severe. The Americans would have to send their bombers, unescorted, into the teeth of Japan's home defense network. Japanese pilots embraced this conclusion with grim satisfaction. Let the Americans come. Let them send their silver fortresses across the Pacific, lumbering at 25,000 feet, predictable and alone. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Service had conserved their strength precisely for this moment. Newer fighters like the Nakajima Ki-84 Frank and the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony possessed respectable performance, not equal to the best American carrier fighters perhaps, but adequate when enjoying the defensive advantage. More importantly, they possessed numbers. Hundreds of fighters ringed the home islands, positioned at bases that could respond within minutes to incoming raids. The pilots might be younger now, less experienced than the veterans lost in the grinding battles of 1943 and 1944. But they fought for their homeland, their families sleeping in wooden houses below. Desperation could substitute for skill, and they had been right for months. Throughout late 1944 and into early 1945, B-29s flew their missions to Japan without escort. The raids were devastating. General Curtis LeMay's decision to switch from high-altitude precision bombing to low-level incendiary attacks would eventually burn entire cities to ash. But they came at cost. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire claimed bombers on nearly every mission. Crew losses mounted. The absence of escorts meant B-29 gunners faced multiple fighter passes, their own ammunition expenditure becoming critical, their nerves fraying as bandits approached from sun positions and cloud banks. The isolation pressed on them like the thin air at altitude. They were alone. The Americans, of course, understood the problem with painful clarity. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, made escort fighters for the B-29 campaign a priority second only to the bombers themselves. But conventional thinking offered no solution. Standard American fighters like the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, magnificent in European skies, lacked the range even with drop tanks. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning came closer but remained marginal. Carrier-based F-6F Hellcats could provide local defense but not strategic escort across 1,500 miles of ocean. The answer, when it came, emerged from an unlikely hybrid of British desperation and American industrial capacity. In 1940, the Royal Air Force had commissioned North American Aviation to build P-40 Warhawks under license. Instead, North American's chief designer Edgar Schmude proposed creating an entirely new fighter around the Allison V-1710 engine, incorporating aerodynamic lessons from captured German aircraft and wind tunnel research. The RAF accepted, desperate for any competent fighter as the Battle of Britain raged. The result, designated Mustang by the British, proved fast and maneuverable, but disappointingly mediocre above 15,000 feet, where the Allison engine gasped for air. Then came the elegant transformation that would reshape aerial warfare. In 1942, Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang and immediately recognized what it needed: the Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the legendary Spitfire. The Merlin, supercharged and optimized for high altitude, gave the Mustang exactly what it lacked: power where it mattered most. By late 1943, P-51B Mustangs equipped with Packard-built Merlin engines began reaching operational squadrons. The marriage of American aerodynamics and British engine technology created something unprecedented: a fighter that could outperform anything in the sky while carrying enough fuel to escort bombers to Berlin and back. But Berlin lay 1,000 miles from England. Tokyo lay 1,500 from the Marianas. Could the Mustang stretch even further? The answer lay in brutal mathematics and innovative engineering. A P-51D Mustang carried 184 gallons of internal fuel plus two 110-gallon drop tanks, giving it a total capacity of 404 gallons. At economical cruise settings, approximately 300 miles per hour at optimal altitude, the Merlin engine consumed roughly 70 gallons per hour. This yielded a theoretical range of over 1,700 miles with reserves for combat. The numbers worked, barely, but they left almost no margin for error. Pilots would need to fly with precision, maintain strict fuel discipline, and trust that combat over Japan would be brief. Navigation had to be perfect. A single course error could mean hundreds of aircraft running dry over the Pacific, their pilots choosing between ditching and death. The risks were extraordinary, but so was the potential payoff. If Mustangs could escort B-29s to Tokyo, the entire calculus of the air war would shift. Japanese fighters, forced to engage through a screen of American escorts, would bleed strength with each mission. The bomber formations, no longer isolated, could strike with impunity. The psychological impact would be devastating. Nowhere in Japan would be beyond American reach, not even the Emperor's Palace. The first extended-range P-51 missions to Japan flew in February 1945, shortly after airfields on Iwo Jima became operational. Iwo's capture, purchased with terrible marine casualties on those volcanic slopes, suddenly placed American fighters 750 miles from Tokyo instead of 1,500. Even so, the mission distances remained formidable. Round trips of 1,500 miles, flown over open ocean with no alternative landing sites, represented the longest fighter escort missions in history. For the Mustang pilots of the 7th Fighter Command, men who had trained in the clear skies over California and Texas, the reality of Pacific escort duty came as a shock, different in character, but equal in intensity, to what they would inflict on Japanese defenders. Everything about these missions demanded a recalibration of instinct. Fighter pilots were taught to trust their engines, to push throttles forward in combat, to trade fuel for survival without hesitation. Now, they had to fly with accountant's precision, monitoring fuel gauges with neurotic attention, resisting every impulse to climb aggressively or maneuver hard. They flew in loose formations designed to minimize drag, maintaining altitudes and speeds calculated to squeeze every possible mile from each gallon of fuel. The ocean below offered no forgiveness. Unlike European missions, where a pilot shot down might parachute into occupied France or Germany with some chance of survival and eventual rescue, the Pacific swallowed men without trace. Ditching a P-51 in rough seas typically gave a pilot perhaps 2 minutes before the fighter sank, taking him with it if he failed to execute the escape perfectly. Those who made it into life rafts faced days or weeks drifting on currents, under merciless sun, prey to exposure and sharks. Air-sea rescue capabilities existed, but remained primitive. Every Mustang pilot understood. Engine failure meant death, probably. Running out of fuel meant death, certainly. And yet they flew. On February 16, 1945, 72 P-51s launched from Iwo Jima to escort a B-29 strike on the Nakajima aircraft factory near Tokyo. The mission plan called for the Mustangs to rendezvous with bomber formations north of the island, escort them to the target, provide cover during the bomb run, then return. Total flight time, approximately 7 hours. The pilots settled into their cockpits before dawn, checking fuel loads obsessively, confirming that the external tanks were properly sealed and feeding correctly. They took off into darkness, formed up over the island, then turned north in a long silver stream. The Japanese radar operators tracking them struggled to process what they were seeing. The formations were unmistakable now, B-29 bomber streams at 25,000 feet, as expected, but accompanied by smaller contacts maintaining position alongside. Fighter aircraft. Definitely fighter aircraft. But the numbers refused to make sense. These contacts had appeared more than 700 miles from any American base. They were still flying north, still maintaining formation. Were they some new twin-engine design, a specialized long-range variant the intelligence services had missed? The reports climbed command chains, each level adding its own confusion. In the ready rooms, Japanese pilots received briefings that they greeted with outright skepticism. American single-engine fighters escorting the B-29s? Impossible. Perhaps they were carrier aircraft from a task force lurking offshore. But the altitudes were wrong for carrier fighters, which typically operated lower. And why would the Americans risk their precious carriers so close to Japan's home waters? It made no tactical sense. Some pilots openly suggested the radar operators had made identification errors. Others worried this might be a feint, a trick to draw defenders away from the real attack. The truth revealed itself with terrible clarity when the first Nakajima Ki-84s climbed to intercept altitude and found themselves facing P-51s at 28,000 feet, 400 miles from the nearest American carrier, maintaining station beside B-29 formations with casual confidence. The Japanese pilots, many of whom had never encountered Mustangs before, quickly learned what German Luftwaffe veterans already knew. The P-51 was faster, more maneuverable at altitude, and possessed diving characteristics that made it nearly impossible to escape. The silver American fighters pounced on interceptors with aggressive precision, breaking up attack formations before they could reach the bombers. Warrant Officer Isamu Sasaki, flying a Ki-84 that day, would later recall his shock at the engagement. We climbed as fast as our engines could manage, expecting to find the bombers alone as always. When I leveled off and looked ahead, I saw them. Dozens of long-nosed fighters with American markings positioned perfectly between us and the B-29s. My first thought was that I had gone mad, that the stress of months of combat had finally broken my mind. These fighters could not be here. It was not possible, but they were here, and they came for us like demons. The combat lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though survivors described it as feeling both instantaneous and eternal. Japanese fighters attempting to press through to the bombers found themselves engaged immediately by Mustang flights working in coordinated pairs. The Americans held every advantage: altitude, speed, numbers, and, most devastatingly, freedom of action. The Japanese pilots, responsible for stopping the bombers, had to press their attacks regardless of the escorts. The Americans could choose their engagements, could dive away when outnumbered, could return when circumstances favored them. It was a slaughter. 7 P-51s were lost that first day, primarily to Japanese anti-aircraft fire rather than fighters. It was a sustainable rate, especially compared to the 15 bombers the mission might have lost without escort. More importantly, the psychological impact reverberated through both air forces. For American crews, the presence of the little friends, bomber crew slang for escort fighters, transformed the mission from an ordeal into something approaching routine combat operations. Gunners could conserve ammunition, pilots could focus on navigation and bombing runs rather than scanning constantly for attackers. The isolation lifted. For Japanese defenders, the appearance of P-51s over Tokyo represented a catastrophe that transcended tactical concerns. The home islands, inviolate for 3 years after Doolittle's single carrier-launched raid in 1942, had become just another contested battlefield. The promise that Japan's geographic remoteness would bleed American strength now revealed itself as hollow. If the Americans could bring fighters to Tokyo, could fly them 1,500 miles from bases in the Marianas or 700 from Iwo Jima, then the entire defensive strategy collapsed. There was nowhere to retreat, no sanctuary to preserve strength for a final battle. The enemy had achieved what Japanese planners had deemed impossible. The raids continued, growing in size and frequency. By March 1945, hundreds of Mustangs operated from Iwo Jima, flying multiple missions per week. The Japanese response evolved from shocked disbelief to desperate adaptation to grim acceptance. Fighter units threw everything available against the American formations, knowing losses would be severe, but hoping to exact enough of a price to make the raids unsustainable. It didn't work. The kill ratios favored the Americans catastrophically. Japanese fighters fell at rates of 5-1, sometimes 10-1, while the heavily escorted bomber streams suffered minimal losses. The transformation in Japanese pilot quality accelerated this imbalance. By spring 1945, the experienced veterans who had mocked the idea of American escort fighters over Tokyo were mostly dead, shot down over the Pacific Islands or the Philippines. Their replacements received abbreviated training, sometimes as little as 100 flight hours before being sent to operational squadrons. These young men, many still teenagers, took off to face pilots who had flown combat missions over Europe, who had learned to fight against the Luftwaffe, who brought both superior equipment and hard-won expertise to every engagement. Flight Petty Officer Minoru Suzuki, 19 years old, flew his first combat mission on March 27, 1945, attempting to intercept B-29s bombing Nagoya. His flight of 8 Kai-61s climbed through overcast, emerged into brilliant sunlight at 20,000 feet, and immediately came under attack by 12 P-51s that dove on them from above. I never saw them until they were firing, Suzuki recalled after the war. The first indication was my wingman exploding, just a flash and debris. Then tracers were going past my canopy, and I was trying to turn, but the Mustang was faster in every direction. I dove. I must have dove 6,000 or 7,000 feet before I looked back and saw that I was alone. My entire flight was gone. 8 aircraft, all gone in less than 2 minutes. Yet, even as the tactical situation became hopeless, Japanese propaganda worked furiously to reframe the narrative. Radio broadcasts acknowledged American fighters over the home islands, but characterized them as desperate measures by an enemy running out of options. The official line suggested that these extended-range missions represented the limit of American capability, that the fighters appearing over Tokyo were sacrificing safety for range, arriving with barely enough fuel to fight before fleeing back to their bases. There was a kernel of truth here. Mustang pilots did operate with thin fuel margins, but the propaganda ignored the essential point. The Americans were doing it, successfully, repeatedly, while Japanese countermeasures failed again and again. The symbolic power of the Silver Mustangs became almost as important as their tactical effect. Unlike the dark-painted Japanese fighters or the olive-drab aircraft common earlier in the war, by 1945, most P-51s flew in natural metal finish, polished aluminum that gleamed in the sun. The choice was practical. Bare metal saved weight and actually improved performance by a few miles per hour. But the psychological impact was profound. The Silver Fighters announced their presence visually from miles away, visible to civilians below and defenders alike. They projected absolute confidence. "We don't need camouflage," they seemed to say, "because you can't stop us anyway." Below, in the cities, those fighters protected bombers above. Japanese civilians watched the contrails etch white lines across blue skies and understood that their government's promises of defense had become lies. The Americans could reach anywhere, strike anything. The silver aircraft became harbingers not just of bombs, but of inevitability. Children learned to recognize the distinctive silhouette. Women working in factories stopped to watch formations pass overhead, calculating how long until the air raid sirens would sound, wondering if their neighborhood would burn tonight. In the Imperial General Headquarters, planners grappled with an unsolvable problem. Every fighter sent up to challenge the American escorts was a fighter that couldn't be husbanded for the inevitable invasion. Every pilot killed defending the home islands was a pilot who wouldn't be available to fly suicide missions against American landing fleets. But allowing the raids to continue unopposed meant accepting the systematic destruction of Japan's remaining industrial capacity, the burning of its cities, the starvation of its population through naval blockade and aerial interdiction. There were no good choices, only gradations of catastrophe. By April 1945, some Japanese units stopped attempting coordinated intercepts entirely, instead adopting desperate tactics that reflected their hopelessness. Individual fighters would attempt high-speed diving attacks directly through bomber formations, hoping to ram a B-29 and take it down in exchange for their own lives. Others waited until the Mustang escorts reached the limit of their fuel and had to turn back, then attacked the stragglers. These tactics occasionally succeeded. A few bombers fell, a few Mustangs were caught, but they couldn't alter the fundamental equation. American industry produced Mustangs faster than Japanese pilots could shoot them down. American training programs turned out pilots faster than combat could kill them. The mathematics of attrition, which Japan had hoped would protect the home islands, now worked inexorably in reverse. The final irony was that Japanese intelligence had known about the P-51 Mustang's development for years. Reports from Europe in 1943 and 1944 described the aircraft's performance and range. Captured documents discussed its specifications. But knowing something intellectually and confronting its reality are different experiences entirely. Japanese planners had calculated ranges based on standard fighter tactics, relatively high-speed cruising, allowances for extended combat, margins for contingencies. What they hadn't accounted for was American willingness to push those margins to absolute limits, to fly entire missions at economy settings that would make a pilot vulnerable during combat, to accept losses from mechanical failure and fuel exhaustion as acceptable costs. This reflected a deeper difference in how each side approached the war by 1945. For the Americans, individual aircraft and even individual pilots, while valued, were ultimately expendable resources in service of strategic objectives. Losing a dozen Mustangs to achieve perfect escort of 300 bombers was a trade the commanders would make without hesitation. The industrial base could replace the aircraft within weeks. The training pipeline could replace the pilots within months. This calculus, cold-blooded but effective, meant American forces could operate at levels of risk that seemed suicidal to Japanese planners still thinking in terms of conserving scarce resources. For the Japanese, each aircraft lost represented an irreplaceable asset. The home island's industrial capacity in 1945 could barely keep existing units equipped, much less replace combat losses. Pilot training had become a grim joke. Barely enough instruction to take off and land. Certainly not enough to survive combat against experienced opponents. Some Army air units were reduced to providing new pilots with hand-drawn diagrams of American fighter silhouettes and advice to aim for the bombers and ignore the escorts. It was advice that got young men killed while achieving nothing. The symbolic object that crystallized this disparity wasn't the fighters themselves, but something mundane: aviation fuel. American Mustangs ran on 100-octane gasoline, refined to precise specifications, produced in overwhelming quantities by the massive petroleum industry of Texas, Oklahoma, and California. By 1945, Japanese fighters increasingly flew on fuel blended with additives, turpentine, alcohol, whatever could be found, that fouled engines and reduced performance. Some aircraft literally fell apart in flight as substandard fuel corroded fuel lines and deteriorated seals. American pilots droned across the Pacific, burning high-grade fuel with profligate efficiency, secure in the knowledge that more awaited them on return. Japanese pilots rationed every gallon, knowing that next month's allocation might not arrive, that the tanker bringing it might be torpedoed, that the refinery producing it might be firebombed by the very aircraft they were trying to stop. May 25th, 1945. The sun hangs low over Tokyo Bay as the largest single air raid in history approaches the capital. Over 500 B-29 Superfortresses, stacked in formations that stretch across 30 miles of sky, lumber toward their targets. Alongside them fly 150 P-51 Mustangs, their polished aluminum skins catching the late afternoon light, transforming the fleet into a river of silver that flows inexorably northward. In the ruins below, vast sections of Tokyo have already been burned in previous raids. Those civilians who haven't evacuated to the countryside watch the armada pass overhead with numb acceptance. The air raid sirens wail. The anti-aircraft guns fire, throwing up black puffs of flak that do nothing but mark the altitude of the approaching bombers. A handful of Japanese fighters climb to intercept, so few that they seem almost symbolic, gestures of defiance rather than meaningful defense. High above, in the cockpit of a P-51D named Dallas Blonde, Captain Robert W. Moore scans his fuel gauges and allows himself a moment of satisfaction. This is his 43rd mission, his 20th escort to the Tokyo area. The fuel shows green, plenty for combat, plenty for home. His flight has claimed 11 confirmed kills in the past month, and he's personally downed 3 Japanese fighters. The job has become almost routine, which he knows is a dangerous mindset, but the evidence is impossible to ignore. The escorts work. The Japanese can't stop them. It's not even close anymore. He doesn't think about the fact that his flight log represents something unprecedented in military history. A single-engine fighter pilot flying combat missions over an enemy capital located 1,500 miles from his base. He doesn't reflect on how this achievement disproves every major assumption about the limits of air power that dominated military thinking just 5 years earlier. He's 24 years old from Fort Worth, Texas, and he wants to finish his tour and go home to a country that has never been bombed, never been occupied, never faced the choice between surrender and annihilation. The fact that his Mustang makes that outcome certain for Japan isn't something he dwells on. It's just the job. Below, in a dugout shelter beside what used to be a factory and is now a crater filled with twisted metal, First Lieutenant Saburo Sakai watches the American formation through binoculars and feels something like respect mixed with his despair. Sakai is one of Japan's great aces, a pilot who survived Pearl Harbor, the campaigns in China and the Philippines, the grinding battles over Guadalcanal. He has 64 confirmed kills and has been wounded so many times that he can barely see out of his right eye. 2 weeks ago, his unit was issued a notice: no more intercepts. Preserve all remaining aircraft for the final battle. Let the Americans bomb. Save strength for when they attempt to land. He watches the Mustangs weave through the formation, beautiful in their deadly efficiency, and thinks about the first time he saw an American fighter over Tokyo. The shock, the disbelief, the way it shattered every calculation they'd made. He thinks about all the young pilots he's watched take off to challenge these silver ghosts, so few of whom returned. He thinks about how the war is already lost, even though no one will say it, even though the propaganda still promises victory through spirit and sacrifice. The bombs begin to fall. Sakai doesn't move. There's nowhere to go that's actually safe. He stays in the dugout and watches the Mustangs above execute a slow orbit around the bombers, graceful as dancers, untouchable as gods. When this raid is finished, they will turn south and fly home, back to their base on Iwo Jima, where hot food and clean beds await, where maintenance crews will refuel and rearm them for tomorrow's mission. The cycle will repeat until there's nothing left to bomb, or until Japan surrenders. Probably both. The impact of the P-51 Mustang's extended range missions to Japan extended far beyond tactical victories and Japanese fighter losses. The raids forced fundamental changes in Japan's defensive posture and economic planning. With American bombers now guaranteed effective escort, the fiction that strategic industries could be protected collapsed. Factories dispersed into countryside areas, hiding in caves and tunnels, sacrificing efficiency for survival. Workers evacuated from urban centers, further degrading industrial output. The government diverted resources from offensive weapons to civil defense. Fire brigades, shelter construction, emergency food distribution, none of which could actually stop the destruction, but all of which consumed scarce materials and labor. The psychological toll may have been even more significant. Japanese military culture emphasized spirit, will, and sacrifice as paths to victory. American material superiority had been acknowledged but characterized as a weakness, a decadent society that relied on machines rather than warrior virtue. The arrival of P-51s over Tokyo didn't just demonstrate American industrial capacity, it demonstrated that Americans could match Japanese pilots in skill, courage, and determination, while also enjoying overwhelming material advantages. The Americans flew 7-hour missions over open ocean with no alternative landing sites, accepted casualties from fuel exhaustion and mechanical failures, and did it again the next day and the day after that. That wasn't decadence. That was professional military competence, backed by unassailable logistics. For historians analyzing the Pacific War's final months, the Mustang escort missions represent a case study in how military technology intersects with strategy, logistics, and national will. The aircraft itself was superb, perhaps the finest piston engine fighter ever built. But the missions succeeded because an entire system supported them. Iwo Jima's capture, purchased with thousands of Marine casualties, provided the forward base. American shipyards produced the tankers that delivered aviation fuel to that barren island. Refineries in Texas and Oklahoma processed crude oil into high-octane gasoline. Training schools in California and Arizona produced pilots. Factories in Inglewood and Dallas built the aircraft. The Silver Mustangs over Tokyo were not just machines, but manifestations of integrated industrial democracy functioning at peak efficiency. Against this system, Japan had only courage and desperation, neither sufficient to change the outcome. By June 1945, American fighters flew over the home islands with virtual impunity. The strategic bombing campaign reached its crescendo. Entire cities burned in single nights, including Tokyo's devastating raid of March 9-10 that killed more people than either atomic bomb would. The Mustangs escorted every major raid, and their presence meant that bomber losses remained consistently low, well below the rates that would have made the campaign unsustainable. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, B-29s delivered them without fighter escort. The targets were within range of Iwo Jima-based Mustangs, but the planners deemed the risk acceptable given Japan's exhausted air defenses. Those defenses had been exhausted in large part by the grinding attrition of trying to stop escorted bomber raids. The P-51s hadn't delivered the atomic bombs, but they had made them possible by ensuring that the B-29s could operate freely over Japan for months, destroying the industrial and military infrastructure that might have enabled continued resistance. In the years after the war, veterans from both sides occasionally met at commemorations and historical conferences. These encounters produced moments of startling honesty. American pilots would describe the fear of those long overwater flights, the mechanical precision required to make fuel last, the knowledge that a single miscalculation meant death in the Pacific. Japanese pilots would describe the helplessness of trying to defend their homeland against formations they couldn't reach and couldn't stop, the futility of courage without capability, the bitter lesson that spirit meant nothing against superior technology and bottomless resources. Some Japanese veterans admitted that the P-51's appearance over Tokyo affected them more profoundly than even the atomic bombs. The bombs were incomprehensible, city-destroying weapons that seemed like divine punishment, catastrophes beyond human scale. But the Mustangs were merely excellent aircraft flown by skilled pilots, supported by functional logistics, executing a strategy that worked. The bombs suggested the Americans possessed secrets, perhaps even black magic. The Mustangs proved something more demoralizing, that American military competence simply exceeded Japan's at every level, that the war had been unwinnable from the beginning, that all the sacrifice and death had achieved nothing because the fundamental equation never favored Japan's chances. One exchange, recorded at a 1985 symposium in Tokyo, captured the dynamic perfectly. An American pilot, asked how he felt flying those extended-range missions, replied, "Mostly I worried about fuel. Every mission, fuel was the constant concern, and I knew that if I went down, nobody was coming for me." A Japanese pilot responded, "We worried about fuel too, but our worry was different. You worried about having enough fuel to get home safely. We worried about having any fuel at all." The gulf between those concerns encompassed everything: industrial capacity, resource access, logistical competence, strategic depth. America could afford to send fighters on 7-hour missions across the Pacific, accepting losses, secure and replacement capacity. Japan couldn't afford to lose anything, yet lost everything anyway. November 1945. The war is over. Tokyo still smolders. On Iwo Jima, ground crews are preparing P-51 Mustangs for ferry flights back to the United States. The island has already begun its transformation from critical strategic base to historical footnote. Most of the fighters will be scrapped. They served their purpose, and America has no need for thousands of piston-engine aircraft in the emerging jet age. A few will be preserved in museums, placed on pedestals with plaques explaining their role in victory. Some will be sold as surplus to foreign air forces or private collectors. The men who flew them will go home, start families, begin careers, and mostly not talk about the war because who wants to hear about fuel gauges and navigation calculations and the time your entire flight almost ran dry 200 miles from base? In Japan, the survivors are trying to rebuild from wreckage. Former pilots work in factories when they can find employment or in fields when they can't. Some will spend decades processing what happened, how their country's ambitions led to such complete destruction. Others will refuse to process it at all, clinging to alternative histories and what-ifs that allow them to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. A few will become remarkably honest about the experience, writing memoirs and giving interviews that acknowledge Japanese military failures without romanticizing defeat. The P-51 Mustang fades into history as a fighter aircraft that won 2 wars, first escorting bombers to Germany, then to Japan. The myths that surrounded it, the plane that won the war, the greatest fighter of World War II, are exaggerations, but they contain essential truth. The Mustang arrived at moments when Allied air superiority was contested, and its presence tipped the balance decisively. Over Germany in 1944, over Japan in 1945, it provided the capability that strategic bombing theorists had always claimed to possess but couldn't demonstrate without effective escorts. The ability to destroy an enemy's industrial capacity from the air while minimizing friendly losses. What the Japanese pilots had mocked, the idea that a single-engine fighter could escort bombers 1,650 miles to Tokyo, became reality because Americans treated it as an engineering problem rather than an impossible dream. They calculated the fuel loads, refined the cruise settings, captured the forward bases, and flew the missions. The mockery turned to shock, the shock to desperation, the desperation to acceptance. The P-51s kept coming, mission after mission, their silver wings bright against blue skies, harbingers of an ending that everyone could see, but Japan's government couldn't acknowledge until atomic fire forced the admission. The symbolic meaning of those silver aircraft persists. They represented the moment when geographic distance ceased to protect Japan, when the ocean barrier that had seemed impregnable revealed itself as merely wide. They proved that American industry could produce not just numbers, but quality, not just machines, but systems that made those machines effective. They demonstrated that democratic societies could organize for total war as efficiently as militaristic regimes, perhaps more so because their people understood why they fought and participated willingly rather than from compulsion. And in the end, they showed that the question wasn't whether American fighters could reach Tokyo. The question was whether anything could stop them once they arrived. The answer, written in smoke and fire across Japanese skies throughout the spring and summer of 1945, was no. Nothing could stop them. The silver promise they embodied, that American power could reach anywhere, overcome any defense, sustain any effort necessary for victory, was fulfilled completely. The Japanese pilots who had once mocked the very possibility learned the lesson that countless others have learned throughout history. Mockery is easy, reality is unforgiving, and in war, the side that can make the impossible routine usually wins. The P-51 Mustangs returned to Iwo Jima after each mission, their pilots exhausted but alive, their fuel tanks nearly empty but not quite. They made it because they had to, because the alternative was unthinkable, because the mission demanded it. And that, more than performance specifications or tactical innovations, captured the essence of American victory, the willingness to attempt what seemed impossible, the capacity to make it work, and the resources to do it again tomorrow. The silver wings caught the sun one last time, then descended toward volcanic rock and waiting ground crews. Another mission complete. Tokyo still smoldered. The war was already won, though the final surrender remained weeks away. Above the Pacific, the sky stretched empty and blue. No more bombers, no more escorts, no more desperate interceptors climbing to stop what they could not stop. Just silence and the beginning of peace, and the knowledge that some barriers, once broken, can never be restored.